An abandoned puppy barking endlessly in the freezing cold. But why? When a retired firefighter investigates, he discovers something unimaginable. A life hanging by a thread under a tattered jacket. Who left the baby? And why would anyone take such a desperate risk? Stay tuned to uncover a story of mystery, love, and redemption that will leave you speechless. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. The icy wind howled through the dense trees lining the snow-covered road just outside Waynesboro, Virginia. The Blue Ridge Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks obscured by low-hanging clouds that threatened another layer of snow. It was a night when most creatures sought shelter, but not this one. A scrawny puppy, barely more than skin and bones, stumbled along the roadside, its breath puffed into tiny clouds that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. The tiny creature shivered, its thin fur doing little to protect it from the biting cold. Hunger gnawed at its belly, and exhaustion weighed heavily on its tiny paws. Yet something in the air kept it moving, a faint scent perhaps, or an instinct too deep to ignore. Ahead, half buried in the snow, lay an old jacket, torn at the seams and dirt-streaked. It looked as if it had been discarded without a second thought. To anyone else, it would have been just another forgotten item in the wilderness. But to the puppy, it was more. It hesitated, sniffing the frigid air before cautiously approaching the object. The puppy barked, a desperate, piercing sound that cut through the stillness. It circled the jacket, sniffing and pawing at the snow around it. Something about this battered piece of cloth demanded its attention, though no one was there to see or understand. Each bark was a plea, an urgent call that seemed to echo into the void. The puppy didn't give up. Its barking grew louder, more frantic, as if trying to awaken something beneath the jacket. The snow continued to fall, dusting the ground in a fresh blanket of white, but the puppy refused to stop. Its determination was unwavering, even as the cold bit into its tiny body. Down the road, headlights appeared in the distance. A faint rumble of an engine broke the silence, growing louder with each passing second. The vehicle's lights illuminated the snow-covered road, catching the glint of the puppy's fur and the tattered edges of the jacket. The truck slowed, tires crunching over the snow as it approached. Behind the wheel, Roy Hensley squinted through the windshield, his brows furrowed. At first, he thought it was just another stray scavenging for food, but the sound of the barks, sharp, insistent, made him pause. They weren't the aimless cries of a desperate animal. They carried purpose. Roy eased his truck to a stop, the engine rumbling softly as he reached for his flashlight. He had just come from town, where the streets had been deserted and the warmth of the diner's coffee still lingered in his veins. But now, in the cold and isolation of this mountain road, a strange feeling settled over him, an inexplicable pull that he couldn't ignore. The puppy froze as Roy stepped out of the truck. Its barking softened but didn't cease, its eyes fixed on the jacket as if trying to will him closer. Roy adjusted his scarf, the frigid air biting at his exposed skin, and took a tentative step forward. His boots crunched against the ice-crusted snow, the sound mingling with the faint whistle of the wind. "What's got you so worked up, little one?" Roy muttered, his breath visible in the dim glow of his flashlight. The puppy's tail wagged ever so slightly, but it quickly turned its attention back to the jacket, barking once more. Roy crouched, shining his flashlight over the scene. The jacket looked ordinary at first glance, worn, discarded, out of place in the otherwise pristine snow. But as he leaned in closer, he noticed something odd. The way it bulged, as if something lay beneath it. His stomach tightened. The puppy whined, nudging the edge of the jacket with its nose. Roy hesitated, his firefighter instincts kicking in. Years of responding to emergencies had taught him to trust his gut, and something about this situation didn't feel right. Slowly, he reached out, his gloved hands brushing against the icy fabric. "What's under here?" he whispered, more to himself than to the puppy. With a gentle tug, Roy lifted the edge of the jacket. His heart skipped a beat as the beam of his flashlight illuminated what lay beneath. The puppy's barking stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft whimper. Roy froze, his breath catching in his throat. Beneath the jacket, Curled into a tiny, fragile bundle was a baby. Its skin was pale, almost blue, and its tiny chest barely moved with shallow breaths. A thin cloth was its only barrier against the cold. Roy's mind raced. He'd seen his share of emergencies, but nothing had prepared him for this. The snow continued to fall, its quiet descent at odds with the storm of emotions raging inside him. He scooped the baby into his arms, cradling it against his chest. "You're okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if the words were meant for the baby, the puppy, or himself. The infant stirred slightly, a faint cry escaping its lips, a sound so small it was almost swallowed by the wind. The puppy wagged its tail furiously, its eyes fixed on Roy with a look that seemed almost human in its intensity. It barked once, a sound of urgency that spurred Roy into action. He stood, cradling the baby tightly as he turned toward his truck. The puppy followed at his heels, its movements quick and determined despite the cold. As Roy climbed into the driver's seat, the gravity of the situation hit him. The baby's life hung by a thread, and every second counted. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker, calm but firm, guiding him through the steps he needed to take. The truck's heater roared to life as Roy glanced at the puppy, now perched on the passenger seat. Its eyes remained fixed on the baby, a silent guardian in the face of uncertainty. Roy's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The road ahead was treacherous, but he had no choice. "Hang on, little one," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of determination and fear. "We're going to get you help." The puppy barked again, a sound that seemed to echo his resolve. With a deep breath, Roy pressed the accelerator, the truck lurching forward into the snowy night. The truck sped through the winding mountain road, its tires crunching over the snow. Inside, the heater blasted warm air, but Roy's hands still trembled on the steering wheel. Not from the cold, but from the weight of the fragile life cradled against his chest. The baby stirred slightly, its tiny cries barely audible over the hum of the engine. Scout, the scrawny puppy, sat alert in the passenger seat, its eyes locked on the bundle in Roy's arms, as if it understood the gravity of the situation. Roy's mind raced. Years of training as a firefighter had prepared him for emergencies, but nothing like this. He'd seen lives saved and lost in the span of moments. But this was different. This was a newborn, a life so tiny, so vulnerable, that it felt like it could slip away at any second. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker of his phone, calm and steady, grounding Roy in the chaos. "Mr. Hensley, are you still with me?" "Yes," he replied, his voice gruff but steady. "I've got the baby wrapped up as best I can, still breathing, but it's weak. I'm about 10 minutes out from the hospital." "Good," the dispatcher replied. "Keep the baby warm and monitor its breathing." "You're doing great, sir." Roy tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw set with determination. The snow fell heavier now, the road ahead growing more treacherous. Scout let out a small whimper, as if sensing the tension. Roy glanced at the puppy and gave a faint nod. "We're going to make it," he muttered, more to himself than to his passengers. The hospital's emergency room came into view, its fluorescent lights piercing through the darkness. Roy barely slowed as he pulled into the driveway, the truck skidding slightly on the icy pavement. He threw it into park and leaped out, clutching the baby tightly to his chest. Scout scrambled after him, its small paws slipping on the pavement but never faltering. The ER doors slid open, and the chaos of the hospital swallowed him whole. Nurses and doctors rushed toward him, their expressions shifting from confusion to urgency as they saw the baby in his arms. "I found the baby," Roy blurted, his voice louder than intended. "Out in the cold, barely alive." A nurse with a warm, steady presence stepped forward, reaching for the bundle. "Give the baby to me," she said firmly, but gently. Roy hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming to keep holding on. Then, with a deep breath, he handed the baby over. The nurse unwrapped the makeshift coverings, her experienced hands moving quickly to assess the baby's condition. She turned to the nearest doctor. "Hypothermia. Severe. We need warming blankets and an incubator. Now." Roy stood frozen, his chest rising and falling as he watched them whisk the baby away. Scout nudged his leg, grounding him. He looked down at the puppy, its wide eyes reflecting his own mixture of fear and helplessness. "We did our part, didn't we?" he murmured, scratching Scout's head. "Now it's up to them." Hours passed in the sterile waiting room. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the air. Roy sat in a stiff plastic chair, Scout curled up at his feet. Despite the puppy's exhaustion, its ears perked up at every sound, its eyes darting toward the hallway where the baby had been taken. Roy leaned back, his mind drifting. The hospital reminded him of the countless hours he'd spent here years ago, holding his wife's hand as she fought a losing battle against cancer. The memories came unbidden, sharp and painful, but he didn't push them away. Instead, he let them settle, like snowflakes on a quiet winter's night. "I promised you I'd keep going," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Didn't know it'd be like this, though." Scout let out a soft bark, startling Roy out of his thoughts. He smiled faintly and reached down to rub the puppy's head. "You've got a knack for keeping me in the moment, don't you?" The sound of footsteps broke the quiet. A nurse approached, her expression calm but serious. Roy straightened in his chair, his heart pounding. "The baby's stable," she said. "Still critical, but stable. You got the child here just in time." Relief flooded through Roy's body, leaving him momentarily weak. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank God." The nurse hesitated, then added, "We're going to have social services involved. It's standard procedure in cases like this. The authorities will want to talk to you about how you found the baby." Roy stiffened. He'd expected this, of course, but the thought of explaining the bizarre chain of events felt surreal. He nodded again. "Whatever it takes." As the nurse walked away, Roy turned his attention back to Scout. "You're part of this too, you know," he said. "Can't let you slip away without your share of the credit." Scout wagged its tail, its small body vibrating with enthusiasm. Roy chuckled softly, the first real laugh he'd managed all night. Detective Carolyn Grayson arrived not long after, her sharp eyes scanning the room before landing on Roy. She was tall and composed, with a no-nonsense air that reminded him of the women he used to work with at the firehouse. She extended a hand. "Mr. Hensley, I'm Detective Grayson. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened tonight." Roy shook her hand firmly, nodding. "I figured you'd need to. Have a seat." As they settled into the plastic chairs, Roy recounted the night's events. Scout's barking, the tattered jacket, the discovery of the baby. Detective Grayson listened intently, taking notes on a small pad. Her face remained unreadable, but her questions were pointed and efficient. "Did you see anyone else nearby? Any vehicles or footprints in the snow?" she asked. Roy shook his head. "Nothing. It was just me and Scout out there." Her gaze shifted to the puppy, who was now snoozing at Roy's feet. A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Seems like you've got yourself a little hero there." Roy's chest swelled with pride. "Yeah, he's something special." As the night wore on, Roy found himself reflecting on the strange twists of fate that had brought him here. A random turn of events? Or something more? He didn't have an answer, but as he looked down at Scout, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos around them, he felt a quiet sense of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, Roy didn't feel alone. Detective Carolyn Grayson's sharp questions lingered in Roy's mind as the night stretched on. The waiting room, once a place of frantic motion, now seemed eerily still. Scout had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curling into a tight ball at Roy's feet, its soft snores the only sound breaking the silence. Roy, however, couldn't rest. The baby's fragile image burned into his thoughts, every shallow breath it had taken replaying in his mind. Roy glanced toward the hallway, where the baby remained in intensive care. The nurse's words from earlier echoed in his ears. Critical, but stable. It was a relief, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. And then there was the question he couldn't shake. Who could have left a baby out there in the cold? He reached down, absently stroking Scout's soft fur. The puppy stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Roy sighed, his mind drifting back to the moment he had uncovered the baby under the jacket. It had been sheer instinct that made him act, but now that he had time to think, the weight of it all felt crushing. Hours later, Roy was jolted from his thoughts as a doctor approached. Her face was calm but weary, the look of someone who had seen too much but refused to let it show. "Mr. Hensley," she said gently, "I wanted to give you an update on the baby." Roy stood quickly, Scout lifting its head at the movement. "How's the little one doing?" The doctor offered a small smile. "Better than we expected, considering the circumstances. We've managed to stabilize the baby's body temperature, and the vitals are improving. It's still critical, but things are looking more hopeful." Roy exhaled, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he murmured. Do you know how long they were out there?" She nodded, her expression darkening slightly. "Judging by the level of hypothermia and dehydration, it had to be several hours. If you hadn't found the baby when you did." Her voice trailed off, leaving the grim conclusion unspoken. Roy's jaw tightened. Several hours. Out in that freezing cold. His mind raced with questions. Why would someone do this? Who could abandon a baby like that? The doctor placed a hand on his arm, drawing him back to the present. "You saved that baby's life," she said firmly, "and so did your little friend there." She nodded towards Scout, who wagged its tail weakly in response. Detective Grayson returned shortly after the doctor left, her notepad in hand. She sat down beside Roy, flipping through her notes. "We've started digging into the case," she began. "The note we found in the jacket is our first solid lead." Roy furrowed his brow. "The note?" Grayson nodded. "It was crumpled up in the pocket of the jacket. Just a few words. Please save him." "I had no choice." She looked up, her gaze piercing. "It doesn't tell us much, but it suggests desperation, not malice." Roy's heart twisted at the thought. Desperation. He could feel the weight of that word, its edges sharp and unforgiving. He glanced down at Scout, who was now licking its paws absently, oblivious to the gravity of their conversation. "Do you think it was the mother?" he asked quietly. "Who left the note?" "Possibly," Grayson replied, "but we don't know for sure. The jacket's a dead end so far. No tags, no identifying marks. But we're expanding the search radius and interviewing people in the surrounding towns." Roy leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Why go through the trouble of leaving a note if you're just going to abandon the baby in the cold?" Grayson's expression softened slightly. "People do desperate things when they feel they have no other options. Maybe she thought someone would find the baby quickly. Maybe she didn't think at all." She closed her notepad and stood. "We'll figure it out, Mr. Hensley. In the meantime, you should get some rest." Roy gave a curt nod, though he knew sleep would be impossible. As Grayson walked away, he turned his attention back to Scout, who had finally stretched out across the floor. "What do you think, buddy?" he murmured. "Reckon we'll ever understand why people do the things they do?" Scout let out a soft bark as if in agreement. The next morning, Roy was allowed to visit the baby for the first time. A nurse led him to the neonatal intensive care unit, where the infant lay in an incubator, tiny wires and tubes connecting it to various machines. The sight was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. Roy stood silently for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. The baby looked so small, so fragile, but it was alive, and that was what mattered. A voice broke his reverie. "They're fighters at this age," the nurse said softly. "Stronger than they look." Roy nodded, his gaze never leaving the baby. Have they named the little one yet?" The nurse shook her head. "Not yet, until we locate family or legal guardians. The baby's technically under the hospital's care." Roy hesitated before speaking again. "If it's okay, can I call them Hope for now?" The nurse smiled warmly. "Hope, that's a beautiful name." As the hours passed, news of the baby's rescue spread through the hospital and beyond. Local reporters began showing up, eager to interview the man who had saved a newborn from the freezing cold. But Roy had no interest in the spotlight. He waved them off, staying close to the NICU and Scout, who had become something of a mascot among the staff. It wasn't long before social media picked up the story. A nurse had posted a picture of Scout sitting dutifully by Roy's side, the caption reading, "Not all heroes wear capes, some have 4 paws." The post went viral almost instantly, drawing attention from across the country. For Roy, the sudden attention was overwhelming. He hadn't set out to be a hero. He'd just done what he thought was right. But as the world watched and speculated, he found himself questioning the choices that had led to this moment. Who had left the baby? Why had they chosen that particular spot? And what would happen now? Later that evening, as the hospital quieted down, Roy sat in the waiting room once more, Scout curled up beside him. His thoughts drifted back to the note Detective Grayson had mentioned. Please save him. I had no choice. He couldn't shake the feeling that the note was more than a cry for help. It was a clue, a piece of a puzzle that he didn't yet understand. And as much as he wanted to put the night behind him, he knew he couldn't, not until he had answers. Scout stirred, nudging his leg with its nose. Roy looked down at the puppy and smiled faintly. Guess we've got some work to do, huh? He said softly. Scout barked once, its tail wagging. Roy leaned back in his chair, his resolve hardening. Whoever had left that baby out in the cold, they'd done it for a reason, and he was determined to find out what it was. The morning light filtered through the hospital's windows, casting long shadows on the linoleum floors. Roy sat in the waiting room, his hands clasped tightly together as the events of the past night replayed in his mind. The image of the baby, now called Hope, lying motionless under the tattered jacket, was etched into his thoughts. But more than anything, it was the note that haunted him. Please save him. I had no choice. Scout, sensing his unease, nudged his leg with a small bark, drawing him out of his thoughts. You're right, buddy, Roy muttered, scratching the puppy behind its ears. We can't stop now. There's more to this than we know. Roy stood, his determination hardening. The baby was safe for now, but someone had deliberately left Hope out in the cold, trusting fate, or a miracle, to intervene. That miracle had come in the form of Scout's unrelenting barks, but it wasn't enough. There were still questions to answer, and whoever had written that note was out there somewhere. The hospital halls were quieter now, the frenzy of the night giving way to a subdued morning routine. As Roy walked toward the NICU, he spotted Detective Grayson talking with a nurse. The detective's sharp gaze landed on him, and she approached with purpose. Mr. Hensley, she began, her voice steady. We've expanded the investigation. Officers are canvassing nearby towns, and we're reviewing surveillance footage from the area. I wanted to let you know that the baby is receiving full protection while under hospital care. Roy nodded, appreciating her thoroughness. Have you found anything else? About the jacket or the note? Grayson sighed, her lips pressing into a thin line. Not yet. The note suggests desperation, but that's all we have to go on. Whoever left the baby knew someone might find them, but it's a dangerous gamble. Roy's jaw tightened. A gamble that almost didn't pay off. The detective's expression softened slightly. You and that puppy saved a life, Mr. Hensley. Don't lose sight of that. Roy didn't respond. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more than desperation, more than chance. That afternoon, Roy decided to drive back to the spot where he had found the baby. He needed to see it again, to search for anything the darkness might have hidden. Scout eagerly hopped into the truck, wagging its tail as Roy adjusted the heater. The drive felt longer this time, the quiet snow-covered landscape almost suffocating in its stillness. As the truck approached the curve in the road, Roy slowed to a stop. He stepped out, Scout following close behind, and scanned the area. The jacket was gone, taken by the police as evidence, but the imprint it had left in the snow was still faintly visible. Roy knelt down, running a hand over the cold ground. What happened here? He murmured to himself. Scout sniffed around the area, its small paws crunching in the snow. It barked suddenly, drawing Roy's attention. The puppy was pawing at a patch of snow near the road's edge. Roy moved closer, crouching beside Scout, and brushed the snow away with his gloved hands. Beneath the surface, he found something unexpected. A second note, partially torn and damp from the melting snow. Roy's breath caught as he carefully unfolded the fragile paper. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in haste, but the words were clear. I can't protect him. Please keep him safe. Don't let him end up like me. A chill ran down Roy's spine, and it wasn't from the cold. The note carried a weight that was impossible to ignore, a glimpse into the fear and pain of whoever had left it. He stood slowly, his mind racing. This wasn't just desperation, it was a plea, and it told him one thing for certain: whoever had left hope wasn't far. Roy called Detective Grayson immediately, recounting what he had found. She arrived at the scene within the hour, her notepad in hand and her expression grave. The note was carefully placed in an evidence bag, but even without her saying it, Roy could tell it added complexity to an already murky case. This changes things, Grayson said, her tone measured. Whoever left this baby wasn't just abandoning them. They were trying to save them. Roy nodded, his jaw tight. But why leave them here in the cold? Why not at a hospital or somewhere safe? Grayson sighed, tucking the evidence bag into her coat. Fear, guilt. Maybe they thought they'd be caught if they went to a public place. Or maybe they didn't know where else to go. Roy glanced down at Scout, who was sitting patiently at his side. They trusted someone to find the baby, he said quietly. And it was a hell of a risk. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Roy found himself driving toward Waynesboro's diner, the same one he had stopped at the night before. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but the pieces of the puzzle were starting to connect. The note hinted at someone running from something, or someone, and Roy couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was closer than it seemed. The diner was warm and bustling, a sharp contrast to the cold silence outside. Roy slid into a booth near the window, Scout curling up at his feet. A waitress approached, her smile polite but distracted. "What can I get you, hun?" she asked, balancing a tray on one hip. Roy hesitated, then decided to take a chance. "Actually, I'm looking for someone," he said carefully. "A young woman, maybe in her early 20s. Dark hair, might have been acting nervous or out of place recently." The waitress frowned slightly, setting her tray down. "Can't say I've noticed anyone like that. What's this about?" Roy hesitated again, debating how much to share. "It's connected to that baby found out on the mountain," he said finally, just trying to piece things together. The waitress's expression softened, and she nodded. "I'll ask around," she offered. "You stay safe out there, all right?" As Roy left the diner, the weight of the day settled heavily on his shoulders. The notes, the baby, the unanswered questions, they all swirled in his mind like a storm. Scout trotted beside him, its small frame radiating an unwavering loyalty that brought a faint smile to Roy's lips. Back in the truck, Roy leaned against the steering wheel, staring out at the darkened road. "We're not done yet, Scout," he muttered. "Whoever's out there, they're running out of time." Scout barked softly in response, as if agreeing. Roy started the engine, the hum of the truck filling the silence as they drove back toward the hospital. The race wasn't just to save the baby anymore. It was to uncover the truth, and maybe, just maybe, to save someone else in the process. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as Roy and Scout approached the hospital once again. The note he had found earlier replayed in his mind, its shaky words carrying the weight of desperation and a plea for protection. "Please keep him safe. Don't let him end up like me." It wasn't just a cry for help. It was a window into the life of someone who had likely been pushed to the brink. As Roy pulled into the parking lot, Scout let out a soft bark, as if sensing the growing tension. Roy reached down, scratching the puppy behind its ears. "I don't know where this is all leading, buddy," he muttered, "but we're not giving up." Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was calm but somber. The quiet hum of machines and muffled conversations gave the place an air of both hope and uncertainty. Roy made his way to the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, where baby Hope remained in her incubator, her tiny body surrounded by tubes and wires. Nurse Bethany Carter greeted him with a warm smile as he approached. She had been one of the first to care for Hope upon her arrival and had since developed a soft spot for the baby. "You're back," she said gently. "She's holding on. Stronger than we thought she'd be after what she went through." Roy stepped closer to the incubator, his heart twisting at the sight of the fragile infant. Her tiny chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, a testament to her resilience. "She's a fighter," Roy murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Bethany nodded. "Babies like her. They remind us how tough life can be, but also how precious it is." Roy glanced at her, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. "You've seen this kind of thing before?" Bethany hesitated, then sighed. "Not exactly like this, but I've worked with children from all kinds of backgrounds. Neglect, abuse, abandonment. It's heartbreaking. But every now and then, someone steps in, someone who makes all the difference." She met Roy's gaze, her eyes steady. "You're that person for her, you know." Roy looked away, the weight of her words pressing heavily on his chest. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had stumbled into a situation far bigger than himself. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said quietly. Bethany placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding. "Not everyone would have stopped, and not everyone would have cared as much as you do." Hours passed as Roy sat by Hope's incubator, Scout curled up at his feet. He found himself talking to the baby, his voice low and steady, as if she could somehow hear and understand him. "You've got a whole lot of people rooting for you, little one," he said softly. "And that puppy down there? He's not going anywhere. Neither am I." Scout let out a small whimper, lifting its head as if to agree. Roy smiled faintly, the first hint of lightness he'd felt in hours. Detective Grayson arrived later that evening, her expression unreadable as she approached. She gestured for Roy to join her in a quiet corner of the NICU. "We've been able to gather more information," she began. "The second note you found, it's consistent with the first. Same handwriting, same tone. Whoever left those notes was in a rush, but they cared enough to try to communicate." Roy frowned. "Any leads on who it might be?" Grayson nodded. "We've traced the jacket to a small thrift store in Waynesboro. The storekeeper remembered selling it to a young woman a few weeks ago. Mid-20s, dark hair, looked anxious. She paid in cash. Didn't give a name." Roy's jaw tightened. "Sounds like she's been planning this for a while." "Possibly," Grayson said. "Or she was running out of options." She studied him for a moment. "There's something else. We've been talking to people in the area, and we've heard about a woman matching that description. Single mother, struggling to make ends meet, recently disappeared from her apartment. Her name's Marie Talbot." Roy's mind raced. "You think she's the one who left the baby?" Grayson nodded slowly. "It's likely. We're still piecing it together, but it fits the profile. Desperation, isolation, fear. If she's running, she might not have had many options." Roy glanced back toward the incubator where Hope lay, the fragile life that had brought them all together. "What happens to her if you don't find Marie?" Grayson's expression softened. "For now, she stays here, under hospital care. After that, it depends. Social services will step in if no family comes forward." The thought of Hope being placed into the foster system made Roy's stomach twist. "She deserves better than that," he said quietly. Grayson's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she nodded. "She does." As the night wore on, Roy found himself sitting outside the NICU, Scout by his side. The puppy rested its head on his lap, its warm presence a comfort in the otherwise sterile environment. Roy's thoughts wandered to Marie Talbot, the woman who might have left Hope in the snow. What kind of life had driven her to such a desperate act? He couldn't shake the words from the note. "Don't let him end up like me." It wasn't just a plea, it was a warning. Whoever Marie was, she had faced something so terrible that she was willing to risk everything to protect her child. The next morning, Bethany approached Roy with an envelope in hand. "This came in for you," she said, her tone curious. Roy took it, frowning as he opened the envelope. Inside was a simple piece of paper with a handwritten message. "Thank you for saving him. Please forgive me." There was no signature, no clue as to who had sent it. His heart raced as he showed the note to Grayson, who appeared moments later. "Looks like she's still watching," the detective said, her tone both cautious and intrigued. Roy stared at the note, his mind swirling with questions. If Marie was still out there, why hadn't she come forward? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning? Scout barked softly, drawing his attention. Roy reached down, scratching the puppy's ears as a wave of determination washed over him. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. For her, for hope. The handwritten note from Marie Talbot had been a catalyst, pushing Roy deeper into a mystery he hadn't expected to become his own. As he sat in the hospital's quiet waiting area, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. Scout lay at his feet, as always, its soft breaths a grounding presence amidst the whirlwind of unanswered questions. Detective Grayson's words from earlier echoed in Roy's mind. She's still watching. The idea that Marie was out there, silently keeping tabs on the situation, filled him with a mixture of frustration and empathy. What had driven her to this? And why did she feel she couldn't come forward? Scout stirred, letting out a small bark that broke the silence. Roy reached down, scratching the puppy behind its ears. "You've got good instincts, buddy," he muttered. "Let's hope we can figure this out before it's too late." Later that morning, Roy met with Detective Grayson in a small conference room just off the hospital's main lobby. A bulletin board behind her was cluttered with photographs and notes, all centered around the case. The thrift store where the jacket had been purchased, the gas station security footage showing a woman with a baby in a carrier, and a map marked with key locations. Each detail painted a clearer picture of Marie Talbot's last days before she disappeared. Grayson gestured to the board. "This is what we have so far. Marie bought the jacket about 3 weeks ago. Around the same time, she stopped showing up at the diner where she worked. Her landlord reported that she left her apartment suddenly, leaving behind most of her belongings." Roy frowned. "Any idea why she ran?" Grayson nodded, her expression grim. According to a co-worker, Marie had been trying to leave an abusive relationship. She never said much about it, but there were signs. Bruises she tried to hide, changes in her schedule to avoid someone showing up. Roy's stomach twisted. He had seen the effects of abuse during his years as a firefighter, but it never got easier to hear about. And the baby? She was terrified for him, Grayson said. Her co-worker mentioned that Marie once said, "I can handle anything as long as he's safe." She looked at Roy, her expression softening. Leaving him out there was probably her way of trying to keep him away from whoever she was running from. Roy leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. So, what now? How do we find her? Grayson's jaw tightened. "We're working on it. The gas station footage shows her heading west, but after that, we lose the trail. If she's hiding, she's doing a good job of it." The next day, Roy decided to visit the diner where Marie had worked. It was a small, unassuming place on the outskirts of town, the kind of spot where locals gathered for coffee and conversation. Scout trotted alongside him as he entered, drawing curious glances from a few patrons. A woman behind the counter, her name tag reading Alice, greeted him with a polite smile. "What can I get you?" Roy hesitated, then pulled out a picture Detective Grayson had provided, a grainy image of Marie from the gas station footage. "I'm not here for food," he said gently. "I'm trying to find this woman. She used to work here, didn't she?" Alice's expression faltered, her smile fading. She glanced at the picture, then at Roy. "You're with the police?" "Not exactly," Roy said. "I found her baby. I just want to help." Alice's eyes widened, and she leaned closer. "You're the one who found him." "Oh, bless you. Poor Marie. She's been through so much." Roy nodded. "Do you know where she might have gone? Alice hesitated, glancing around the diner as if afraid someone might overhear. Finally, she leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. She mentioned a shelter once. Said it was her last resort if things got worse. I think it's called Haven House. It's about 20 miles west of here. Roy felt a spark of hope. Thank you, he said sincerely. You've been a big help. Alice gave him a small smile. If you find her, tell her we're praying for her. Armed with the new lead, Roy drove to Haven House, Scout sitting alert in the passenger seat. The shelter was a modest building surrounded by a chain-link fence, its exterior unassuming but well kept. A sign by the entrance read, "A safe place for new beginnings." Roy parked the truck and approached the front door, his heart pounding. Inside, he was greeted by a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her name tag read, Linda Fowler, Director. "Can I help you?" Linda asked, her gaze flickering to Scout with a hint of amusement. "I'm looking for someone," Roy began, showing her the picture of Marie. "I think she might have stayed here recently." Linda studied the photo, her expression unreadable. "Why are you looking for her?" Roy hesitated. "She left her baby in the snow. I found him, and he's safe now, but I think she was trying to protect him. I just want to understand." Linda's expression softened, and she nodded slowly. "Marie was here, but she left about a week ago. She didn't say where she was going, just that she couldn't stay long." "Did she say why?" Roy pressed. Linda sighed. "She was scared. She mentioned someone who wouldn't stop looking for her. I think she felt like she was putting everyone here at risk by staying." Roy's chest tightened. "Do you have any idea where she might have gone?" Linda shook her head. "She didn't say, but she left this." She reached into a desk drawer and pulled out an envelope, handing it to Roy. "She asked me to give it to someone who came looking for her." Roy opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a short note, written in the same shaky handwriting as before. "Thank you for finding him. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. I'll always love him. Please tell him that." The words hit Roy like a punch to the gut. He folded the note carefully, his mind racing. Marie was still running, still terrified, but her love for her son was undeniable. She had sacrificed everything to keep him safe, even if it meant disappearing completely. Back at the hospital, Roy shared the note with Detective Grayson. She studied it carefully, her brow furrowed. "She's scared, but she's not gone," Grayson said. "She's leaving a trail, even if it's unintentional. We'll find her." Roy nodded, his resolve hardening. "We have to, for her and for Hope." Scout barked softly as if in agreement, and Roy reached down to ruffle the puppy's fur. "We're not giving up," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. As the night settled over Waynesboro, Roy sat by Hope's incubator, his thoughts heavy but determined. The baby stirred slightly, her tiny fingers twitching, and Roy smiled faintly. "She's out there, kiddo," he murmured, "and we're going to bring her back." Scout curled up at his feet, its steady presence a comfort in the storm. The road ahead was uncertain, but Roy knew one thing for sure: they weren't done yet. Roy sat in his truck just outside the hospital parking lot, staring at the note Marie had left at Haven House. Her words lingered in his mind. "Thank you for finding him. I'll always love him. Please tell him that." They carried a pain that only a mother could feel, a desperate love shadowed by fear and hopelessness. Scout sat in the passenger seat, watching Roy with curious eyes. The puppy let out a soft bark, nudging his arm with its nose. Roy sighed, reaching over to scratch Scout's head. "I know, buddy," he murmured. "We're close, but we're not there yet." Detective Grayson's words from earlier played in his mind. She's leaving a trail, even if it's unintentional. It was clear that Marie was running from something, or someone, but Roy couldn't shake the feeling that she was also running towards something. The question was, what? Later that afternoon, Roy found himself at the library, poring over maps of the surrounding area. If Marie was trying to stay off the radar, she wouldn't risk going to another shelter. She would need somewhere remote, somewhere quiet. The thought filled him with unease. A young woman, alone in the wilderness, carrying the weight of her past. It was a dangerous combination. Scout lay curled up under the table, occasionally lifting its head to watch Roy work. As the hours ticked by, Roy traced his finger along a winding road that led deep into the mountains. It was sparsely populated, with only a few cabins scattered across the area. If Marie wanted isolation, it was the perfect place. Roy wasn't the only one chasing answers. Detective Grayson was working tirelessly to track down Marie's history. She sat in her office, flipping through police reports and witness statements. Marie's name appeared in several records, each one painting a clearer picture of her troubled life. Marie Talbot had grown up in a small town a few hours west of Waynesboro. Her childhood was marked by instability, a revolving door of foster homes and fleeting moments of security. By the time she turned 18, she had aged out of the system with little more than a suitcase and a survival instinct. Grayson frowned as she read through the reports. It wasn't hard to see how Marie had ended up in an abusive relationship. Vulnerability made her an easy target. But something about her recent actions didn't align with the profile of someone who had given up. Despite her fear, Marie had fought to keep her baby safe, even if it meant risking everything. Grayson picked up her phone and dialed Roy's number. When he answered, she got straight to the point. "I think I know where she might have gone." The road into the mountains was treacherous, winding through dense forests and steep inclines. Roy gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of life. Scout sat alert in the passenger seat, its ears perked up as if sensing the importance of the journey. Grayson had provided him with a lead, a property deed linked to Marie's biological mother, a woman named Eleanor Talbot. The records showed that Eleanor had owned a small cabin deep in the mountains before her death. It wasn't much, but it was a place Marie might seek refuge. The cabin came into view as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. It was small and weathered, its wooden exterior showing signs of neglect. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, a sign that someone was inside. Roy parked the truck and stepped out, Scout close on his heels. His breath puffed in the cold air as he approached the cabin, each step crunching softly in the snow. He hesitated at the door, raising a hand to knock, but Scout's sudden bark made him pause. The door creaked open slightly, and a pair of cautious eyes peeked through the gap. Marie stood there, her face pale and drawn, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She looked at Roy with a mixture of fear and recognition. "You're the man who found him," she said softly, her voice trembling. Roy nodded. "And you're his mother." Marie allowed Roy and Scout inside, her movements hesitant and guarded. The cabin's interior was sparse but warm, with a small fire crackling in the hearth. Marie gestured for Roy to sit, but her eyes remained wary, darting toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Roy met her gaze, his expression steady. "Because you left your baby out in the cold, and I need to understand why." Tears welled in Marie's eyes, but she blinked them away. "You wouldn't understand," she said, turning away. "Try me," Roy replied, his tone gentle but firm. Marie hesitated, then sank into a chair by the fire. "I didn't have a choice," she began, her voice cracking. "He would have found us. He always does." Roy leaned forward slightly. "Who's he?" Marie swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "Eric, the man I thought I loved. He's dangerous, controlling. When I told him I was leaving, he said I'd never take our son away from him." She paused, her voice breaking. "I had to keep him safe, even if it meant—" Roy nodded, his chest tightening. "Even if it meant letting him go." Marie's tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. "I thought someone would find him," she sobbed. "I thought he'd be better off without me." Roy let her cry, giving her the space she needed. When she finally looked up, he spoke softly. "You made a mistake, Marie. But you didn't give up on him. That counts for something." Marie's eyes searched his face, her expression a mixture of guilt and hope. Is he okay?" Roy nodded. "He's strong, a fighter, just like his mother." The conversation stretched late into the night. Marie shared fragments of her life, her childhood in foster care, her relationship with Eric, and the desperate decisions she had been forced to make. Roy listened intently, his respect for her growing with every word. She wasn't perfect, but she was trying, and that, he realized, was enough. As the fire burned low, Roy made her a promise. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said firmly. "We'll figure this out together." Marie looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and uncertainty. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "Just take care of yourself," Roy replied. "And when you're ready, we'll bring you back to him." Scout let out a soft bark, wagging its tail as if to seal the deal. Marie managed a small smile, the first glimmer of hope breaking through the darkness. Roy guided his truck carefully down the winding road back toward Waynesboro. Scout perched beside him, and Marie huddled in the back seat. The night stretched on, cold and quiet, but the air inside the truck was heavy with tension. Marie's tear-streaked face reflected in the rearview mirror, her gaze fixed on the passing trees, lost in thought. "You don't have to say anything," Roy said gently, breaking the silence. "But if you want to talk, I'm here." Marie didn't respond right away. She hugged herself tightly, as if bracing against more than just the cold. "Do you think they'll take him from me?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. Roy glanced at her in the mirror, his expression soft but firm. "That depends on what happens next. But I can tell you this, you've got people on your side now." Scout barked softly, as if in agreement. Roy reached over to scratch the puppy's head. "You're not alone in this anymore." The next morning, Roy walked into the hospital with Marie and Scout in tow. Detective Grayson was waiting in the lobby, her sharp eyes immediately landing on Marie. For a moment, the two women studied each other, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. "So you're Marie," Grayson said, her tone neither harsh nor gentle. "We've been looking for you." Marie's hands tightened into fists at her sides, but she nodded. "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I'm here." Roy stepped forward, his voice steady. "She's ready to talk, Detective. But this isn't just about her. It's about keeping Hope safe." Grayson's expression softened slightly. "All right, let's start with the truth." Over the next few hours, Marie recounted her story to Grayson and a social worker. She spoke of her childhood in foster care, her relationship with Eric, and the escalating abuse that had driven her to flee. She described the nights she spent awake, clutching her baby in terror, and the unbearable decision to leave him in the snow, praying someone would find him before Eric did. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was saving him." Grayson listened intently, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. When Marie finished, the detective set her pen down and leaned forward. "It's clear you love your son," she said. "But what you did put him in danger. You're lucky Roy and Scout were there." Marie nodded, her shoulders slumping. "I know. I'll never forgive myself for that." Roy, who had been sitting quietly nearby, finally spoke. "She made a mistake," he said, his voice firm. "But she's here now, doing what she can to make it right. That counts for something." Grayson glanced at him, then back at Marie. "It does," she admitted. "But there's still a lot to figure out. We'll do everything we can to protect both you and Hope, but it's going to take time." Word of the story had spread quickly through Waynesboro. The local news had picked up on the miraculous rescue, and now, with Marie stepping forward, the story had taken on new life. The town rallied around the small family, their support pouring in from every corner. The local diner organized a fundraiser, hosting a community breakfast with all proceeds going toward Hope's medical expenses. Flyers were posted on bulletin boards and handed out at church services, urging people to contribute what they could. Donations began pouring in: money, baby supplies, and even offers of legal help for Marie. Roy couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in his community. He watched as people came together, their kindness and generosity shining in the midst of a difficult situation. Even Scout became something of a local celebrity, his picture appearing on donation jars and social media posts with captions like, "The hero who saved Hope." At the hospital, Nurse Bethany Carter couldn't hold back her tears when Marie finally met her son. The baby was still small and fragile, but his color had improved, and his tiny cries filled the room with a hopeful sound. Marie approached the incubator hesitantly, her hands trembling. Can I hold him?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Bethany smiled warmly. "Of course, he's been waiting for you." Marie sat in a chair as Bethany carefully placed Hope in her arms. The moment their skin touched, Marie broke down, her sobs racking her body as she cradled her son for the first time since leaving him behind. "I'm so sorry," she whispered over and over, kissing his tiny forehead. "Mommy's here now. I'll never leave you again." Roy stood in the doorway, his chest tightening at the sight. Scout sat beside him, wagging its tail softly as if sensing the importance of the moment. The following days were a blur of activity. Social workers worked with Marie to secure temporary housing and legal protection, while the police continued their investigation into Eric. With Grayson's help, a restraining order was filed, and the search for Eric intensified. Meanwhile, the town's support didn't waver. Donations kept coming, and volunteers stepped forward to help Marie rebuild her life. The diner hosted another event, this time a silent auction, with local businesses donating goods and services to raise funds. Roy found himself at the center of it all, balancing his time between the hospital, community events, and supporting Marie. Despite the chaos, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Hope had brought them all together, and now it was up to them to ensure a brighter future for the baby. One evening, after a long day of meetings and phone calls, Roy sat on the front steps of his small house. Scout curled up beside him. The stars above shone brightly, their light cutting through the darkness. Marie stepped outside, holding a cup of tea, and joined him. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking the quiet. "For everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Roy shook his head. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Just take care of yourself and Hope. That's all I care about." Marie smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "You're a good man, Roy." "And Scout?" "He's a good dog." Roy chuckled, scratching Scout's ears. "He's the real hero in all this." Scout let out a small bark, his tail wagging. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past beginning to lift. As the town rallied around them, it became clear that Hope's story wasn't just about one baby or one mother. It was a story of resilience, community, and the power of kindness. Strangers became allies, and a small town proved that even in the darkest times, light could shine through. For Roy, it was a reminder of the importance of connection, and for Marie, it was a chance to rebuild, not just for herself, but for her son. The warmth of community support had brought a semblance of stability to Marie and Hope's lives, but the shadows of the past still lingered. As the days turned into weeks, Marie worked tirelessly to prove she could provide a safe and loving home for her son. But rebuilding trust, with herself, with those who had helped her, and even with Hope, was a journey fraught with challenges. Roy watched her transformation with a mixture of admiration and concern. Marie had taken steps to confront her fears, attending counseling sessions arranged by the local shelter and working closely with social services to create a stable environment for Hope. But despite her progress, He could see the guilt that weighed heavily on her. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch of Roy's modest home, Marie broke the silence. "Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Roy turned to her, his expression gentle but firm. "He's a baby, Marie. He doesn't hold grudges. What he needs is for you to forgive yourself." Marie looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. "That's the hard part," she admitted. "Every time I look at him, I see the mistakes I made." Roy leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Mistakes don't define you. How you move forward does. And you're doing everything you can to make it right. That's what matters." The past wasn't done with Marie yet. Detective Grayson arrived one evening with news that sent a ripple of anxiety through the fragile peace they'd built. Eric, the man Marie had fled from, had been located. He had been arrested in a nearby town after a bar fight, and the police had connected him to outstanding warrants for domestic violence. Marie's reaction was immediate. Her hands shook, and her breathing quickened as she processed the news. "He's not coming near Hope, is he?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. Grayson's tone was steady and reassuring. "No, he won't. The restraining order is in place and he's facing serious charges. But I wanted you to know that he's no longer a threat." Marie exhaled shakily, relief washing over her. But the encounter also forced her to confront the emotional scars Eric had left behind. With Grayson's help, she agreed to file a formal statement against him, detailing the abuse she had endured. It was a painful process, but one that gave her a sense of closure. As Marie navigated the complexities of her past, the bond between her and Roy deepened. Roy had become more than just a rescuer. He was a mentor, a confidant, and, in many ways, the family she had never had. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Marie spoke about her childhood for the first time. "I grew up thinking love was something you had to earn," she said quietly. "I thought if I just tried hard enough, people would stay. But no one ever did." Roy's heart ached at her words. "You didn't deserve that, Marie. No one does." She glanced at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I didn't understand what love really was until now." Until Hope Roy nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "He's lucky to have you. And so am I." The first court hearing to determine Hope's custody was a pivotal moment for Marie. The room was sterile and intimidating, the air thick with tension. Roy sat in the back with Scout at his feet, silently lending his support. Marie stood before the judge, her voice steady as she outlined her plans for Hope's future. She spoke of the counselling she had completed, the job she had secured at a local boutique, and the steps she had taken to create a stable home. When asked about her past decisions, she didn't shy away from the truth. "I made mistakes," she admitted, her voice filled with emotion. "But every choice I made was out of love for my son. I can't change the past, but I will spend the rest of my life making sure he knows how much he's loved." The judge listened carefully, nodding occasionally as Marie spoke. When the session ended, Marie returned to Roy's side, her hands trembling. "Do you think it was enough?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Roy placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It was more than enough. You were honest, and you showed them how much you care. That's what matters." The town's support didn't waver during this time. Neighbours stopped by with meals and baby supplies, and the diner organised another fundraiser to help cover legal fees. Scout continued to be a source of comfort and joy, his wagging tail and playful antics lifting everyone's spirits. Even Detective Grayson, who had maintained a professional demeanour throughout the case, began to show a softer side. One afternoon, she arrived with a small stuffed animal for Hope, a sheepish smile on her face. "For the little fighter," she said, handing it to Marie. Marie's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the gift. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Grayson nodded, her expression softening. "You're doing the hard work, Marie. You should be proud of yourself." Weeks later, The final custody hearing brought both relief and joy. The judge ruled in Marie's favor, granting her full custody of Hope with ongoing support from social services. It was a moment of triumph, but also one of reflection. As Marie held Hope in her arms, she turned to Roy and Scout, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said, her voice breaking. Roy smiled, his eyes glistening. "You didn't need me, Marie. You just needed someone to remind you how strong you are." That evening, the town gathered for a celebration at the diner. The air was filled with laughter and music, a stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty that had loomed over them weeks before. Marie stood with Hope in her arms, surrounded by the people who had become her family. Roy raised a glass, his voice carrying over the crowd. "To Marie and Hope," he said, "proof that love and courage can overcome anything." The room erupted in cheers, the warmth of their support wrapping around Marie like a blanket. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. As the night wore on, Marie stepped outside with Roy and Scout, the cool air a welcome reprieve from the lively crowd. She looked up at the stars, her heart full. "I never thought I'd get here," she said softly. Roy smiled, his gaze steady. "You earned it, Marie. You fought for it." She turned to him, her eyes shining. "So did you. Thank you, Roy, for everything." Roy shook his head. "You don't owe me thanks. Just take care of that little one. That's all the thanks I need." Scout barked, wagging his tail, and Marie laughed, a sound full of hope and possibility. The morning sunlight spilled over the rolling hills of Waynesboro, casting a golden glow across the quiet town. Roy stood on his front porch, sipping a cup of steaming coffee, as Scout sat at his feet, tail wagging lazily. The air was crisp, filled with the sounds of birds chirping and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. It was a day that felt like a fresh start. Inside, laughter rang out as Marie and baby Hope shared a quiet moment. The boy was now 6 months old, his small hands reaching for a toy Scout had dropped at his feet. Marie's smile was radiant, a stark contrast to the haunted expression she had worn just weeks ago. It was the kind of smile that spoke of healing, of rediscovered strength. Roy leaned against the porch railing, letting the warmth of the moment wash over him. He had seen a lot in his life, loss, heartache, and redemption. But watching Marie and Hope begin their new chapter was something special. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always the possibility of light. Later that morning, Roy joined Marie in the living room, where Hope sat giggling in a playpen. Scout circled the boy protectively, nudging a soft toy toward him with its nose. "You've got a natural babysitter there," Roy said with a chuckle, nodding towards Scout. Marie laughed, the sound light and full of joy. "I don't know what we'd do without him. Hope adores him." Roy sat down on the couch, his expression turning serious. "How are you feeling about everything? The hearing, the town's support, your future?" Marie hesitated, her hands resting on the edge of the playpen. "It's overwhelming, but in the best way. I've never had people believe in me like this before. It makes me want to do better, not just for Hope, but for everyone who's helped us." Roy nodded, his eyes soft. "You've already come a long way, Marie. The rest will fall into place." The following days were filled with preparations for Marie and Hope's transition into their new home. The town had come together to renovate a small cottage on the edge of town, ensuring it was safe and welcoming for the young family. Volunteers painted the walls, stocked the kitchen, and even planted a small garden in the backyard. When the day finally came for Marie to move in, the entire town gathered to celebrate. It was a modest event, a potluck dinner on the front lawn, but it was filled with warmth and love. Marie stood on the porch, holding Hope in her arms as she thanked everyone for their support. "This isn't just a house," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a home, and it's because of all of you. Thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Roy felt a swell of pride. He caught Scout's eye, giving the puppy a playful pat. "You did good, buddy," he whispered. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Marie started her job at the local boutique, working part-time while balancing her responsibilities as a mother. Hope flourished under her care, his giggles filling the cottage as he grew stronger with each passing day. Roy visited often, always with Scout by his side. The bond between the two families grew stronger, and it wasn't uncommon for Marie to join Roy for dinner, or for Roy to spend afternoons at the cottage, playing with Hope and helping Marie with repairs around the house. One evening, as they sat around a small fire pit in the backyard, Marie turned to Roy, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder why things happen the way they do?" she asked. Roy considered her question, the flickering flames casting shadows across his face. "All the time," he admitted. "But I've learned that sometimes it's not about finding the answer. It's about finding the purpose." Marie nodded slowly, her gaze shifting to Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I think I've found mine," she said softly. As the seasons changed, so did Marie. She became more confident, more at ease with herself and her role as a mother. Her relationship with the town grew as she became an active member of the community, volunteering at local events and organizing fundraisers for the shelter that had once been her refuge. For Roy, life also took on a new sense of purpose. He continued his work with the fire department and the animal shelter, but his bond with Marie and Hope became one of the most meaningful parts of his life. They weren't just neighbors or friends. They were family. One day, as spring began to bloom, Marie invited Roy and Scout to the cottage for a small celebration. It was Hope's first birthday, and she wanted to mark the occasion with the people who had made it possible for them to reach this milestone. The cottage was filled with laughter and the smell of homemade cake. Neighbors stopped by to drop off gifts, and children played in the backyard under the watchful eye of Scout, who had become something of a local legend. Marie stood by the window, watching the scene unfold with a smile. Roy joined her, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a plate of cake in the other. "You've built something special here," he said, his voice filled with pride. Marie turned to him, her eyes shining. "We built it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you." Roy chuckled. "Well, Scout and I are happy to be part of the team." As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Marie gathered everyone in the backyard for a toast. Holding Hope in her arms, she raised a glass of sparkling cider and looked around at the faces that had become her family. "To second chances," she said, her voice steady, "and to the people who make them possible." The crowd erupted in cheers, their glasses clinking together as they celebrated not just Hope's first year, but the journey that had brought them all together. Later that night, as the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Roy and Scout lingered a little longer. They sat on the porch with Marie, the three of them enjoying the quiet after the celebration. "Do you think he'll remember this?" Marie asked, glancing at Hope, who was fast asleep in her arms. Roy smiled. "Maybe not the details, but he'll remember the love. That's what matters." Marie looked at him, her expression soft. "Thank you, Roy, for everything." Roy shook his head. "You don't have to thank me, Marie. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's thanks enough." Scout let out a soft bark, as if to agree, and the three of them sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars above. It wasn't just a new beginning. It was a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family. As the stars twinkled above the peaceful Waynesboro night, the journey of Marie, Roy, Hope, and even Scout had come full circle. From the desperate cold of that fateful night to the warmth of a supportive community, their story was one of resilience, redemption, and the power of compassion. It taught us that even in moments of despair, hope can shine through the smallest gestures: a bark in the cold, a helping hand, or a kind word from a stranger. But what about you? If you were in Roy's position, would you have stopped that night? Could you have looked beyond the surface to see the desperation and love behind Marie's choices? And what do you think we, as individuals and communities can do to support those who feel they've run out of options. This story also reminds us that no one's journey is perfect, and redemption often comes from acknowledging mistakes and taking steps to make things right. It's not just about being a hero, it's about being human. Share your views in the comments below. We can't wait to read them. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and thought-provoking stories like this one. Every journey has a lesson, and together we can uncover them all. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember, even the smallest act of kindness can create ripples that change lives. See you in the next story.